You're listening to episode 310 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. David Loy returns to the podcast to speak about how Buddhist practice can help change the ecological crisis. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page. And if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. If you've not noticed headlines or don't follow current trends in science, our planet is experiencing an ecological crisis. This is not an exaggeration. It is caused by humans and can only be changed by humans taking clear and immediate steps. How might Buddhism contribute to the monumental and critical task of literally saving the planet? David Loy's books include the acclaimed Money, Sex, War, Karma, Notes for a Buddhist Revolution, The Great Awakening, a Buddhist Social Theory, The World is Made of Stories, and Ecodharma, Buddhist Teachings for the Ecological Crisis. He was the Bessel Professor of Ethics, Religion, and Society at Cincinnati's Xavier University, and is qualified as a teacher in the Sambo Kyodan tradition of Zen Buddhism. His articles appear regularly in the pages of major journals such as Tikkun and Buddhist magazines, including Tricycle, Turning Wheel, Shambhala Sun, and Buddha Dharma, as well as in a variety of scholarly journals. He is on the editorial or advisory boards of the journals Cultural Dynamics, Worldviews, Contemporary Buddhism, Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, and World Fellowship of Buddhists Review. He is also on the advisory boards of Buddhist Global Relief, Clear View Project, Zen Peacemakers, and the Ernest Becker Foundation. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice eco-friendly tea. Our guest today returning to the podcast is our friend David Loy. David, welcome. Good to see you again.
Thank you, Ted. Delighted to join you again.
So it's been a while as I think back. The last time I saw you was pleasantly in person in Minneapolis at one of the centers there. You were there to do a talk, and they hadn't quite opened yet, and we had a few minutes to chat. It was wonderful seeing you then. It's wonderful seeing you now.
Thank you.
And I first want to check in with you a bit on Ecodharma Center in Colorado. We've spoken with Kriti Kanko on this podcast before about her experiences there, but I also want to get your perspective. How are things going? And tell the listeners about that in case they haven't listened to that previous episode.
Sure. Well, a few years ago, we managed to buy some property quite close to Boulder. It's way up in the mountains, but really only about a half hour from the city itself. And it's 180 acres, 3 buildings. And the main building, the lodge, needed quite a bit of fixing up, but that's just about done now. And we've been running programs there. So we're limited in terms of space. That is to say, we don't have a resident community, but basically what it amounts to is we have lots of opportunity for different groups to rent us, and very cheaply. We're really making an effort to keep the prices down because we know that, some residential centers can be quite expensive. And so there's already a great deal of interest, and we're already pretty fully booked for this year. And not all of the programs are focused on what I would call Ecodharma, but quite a few, of course, are taking advantage of the fact that we have this really beautiful piece of land with meadows and a little river and lots of forests, adjacent national forests, beautiful views of the Rocky Mountains. So we think we're off to a good start. And we think of it not only as a beautiful place to meditate out in the natural world, but also a place where people can come together and reflect on the implications of Buddhist and related spiritual teachings for what's happening ecologically. Because as we both know, as most of us know, we're in a pretty severe ecological crisis now. And like many others, we're concerned to look at the Buddhist tradition, see what Buddhism has to say about that, and how we might respond to it.
Right. And for those who are listening, I have seen pictures of the facilities and the grounds, and they really are quite magnificent, even by Colorado standards. And of course, it's one of my favorite states to be in, and it is a truly beautiful place. And David, I'm wondering if you might mention, if you recall, what some of the programs coming in this year, 2019, as of this recording, what some of the programs are, and what happens in them. What are those like?
Well, I'm not the best person to answer that question because I'm not on the program committee. I am one of the people on the board. But what's distinctive about many or even most of them is that there's a big component of spending a lot of time meditating outside, weather permitting, which it usually does, in the summer. I mean, July, August, early September are just gorgeous up there. So, for example, I'll be teaching a 2-week retreat with Johann Robbins. I say 2 weeks, actually. It's sort of 2 single weeks sort of together, where we'll be spending most of our time outside. There are a number of beautiful trails and walks that will be going on. We tend to bring our lunch with us, find a beautiful place to meditate and do our own thing. And then in the evening, we gather around a fire, again, conditions permitting, and we have a Dharma talk and discussion following that in the evening. So
great.
It's quite delightful. Yeah.
So let's move on to the main focus of our talk today, and why we're having you back on the podcast is there's a new book. And I'm wondering if you might just describe the book and really what led to you writing this, and what it's about, and why it is so very important.
Sure, happy to do it. Let me just say one more thing about the center while I think of it, which is to say, we have an online presence. So if people want to see some of those photos you mentioned, or even watch a short video, they can look up Rocky Mountain Ecodharma Retreat Center, or even just type in the initials, rmerc.org, and that'll call it up. We also have a Facebook page. Yeah.
And I'll have a link to the site itself on the episode page for this episode too, for those who are listening. So you'll be able to get to that quite easily.
Great. Thanks for that, Ted. So the book has been brewing for a while in response to my long-term concern here. I mean, in general, in the last few years, my focus has been on not only the interaction between Buddhism and modernity, but more specifically, Buddhism in relation to the kind of social challenges that we face today. And it's clear that the most urgent one is really the ecological. And again, not just climate change or global warming, which are like euphemisms for what might be better called global emergency, global climate breakdown, something like that. Anyway, that's just the tip of the larger ecological iceberg when you consider what's happening with, for example, the extinction event. So many species are disappearing so quickly now, much more quickly than the usual background rate.
Well, and even higher than our current humanity murder rate of other species.
So it's happening very quickly, and I expect you, like myself, we're constantly reading these reports where the breakdown is actually worse than we realize. So that's happening. And so there's this fascinating question. We have this wonderful spiritual tradition or cluster of traditions, Buddhism. What does it have to say that can help us understand and respond to this? It's a little tricky because, of course, in Asia itself, the Buddha never talked about a ecological crisis or a global warming because, of course, that wasn't an issue for him. And likewise, the way the tradition developed all over Asia was it really didn't get so engaged in these kinds of larger social issues. So it's not as though Buddhism itself, as if you can go back and look at the old texts and that they're going to tell us what to do. That just isn't there. But there's a lot of things that one can tease out. I mean, if you look back in the Buddhist tradition, what it has to offer with this perspective, there's just a lot there that I think that it can offer. And that's some of the things that I try to talk about in the book.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very important point that you and I and others have been making for quite some time, is that we don't have to have a literal to the letter interpretation review on what is said in whatever our particular type of Buddhism is, because as you've well made the point, there's not just one, there are many different kinds in this cluster. And there are ways in which it can speak to us and help inform how we live in lives with situations that were completely outside the range of experience of Gautama and the disciples. And thinks about the fish in a fish tank, not really so concerned about what traffic conditions will be like outside later on. It's simply outside the range of their experience. It doesn't make them bad fish. And it does mean that there can still be ways in which beings in relationship with each other, with the world, as Gautama was, as the disciples were, as Buddhists have been throughout the centuries, can speak to us in some way. And in this particular topic, we're talking about how it may be around issues of ecology and climate and how that influences how we are in the world. So I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about what you've found. What are some of the things within traditions, quotey fingers for those who are listening and can't see what I'm doing, the tradition, of course, being manifold, that help inform what we're seeing today and how we as Buddhists relate to the world that is not necessarily Buddhist?
Well, the title of my book, like the name of this new center, is Ecodharma. And that's a new term. I mean, I don't think there's anything like it to be found in any of the Asian traditions. Not only new, but what it means is something that's still unfolding. For me, it involves three things, which I try to unpack in the book. The first one certainly includes meditation in the natural world. It's quite striking if you think back on the Buddha's life, at least in terms of the mythology that we have, right? He was actually born outside in a grove, right? When his mother went into early labor. Later, there's a famous story. He's sitting under a tree while his dad's plowing, and he goes into some kind of samadhi. When he leaves home, where does he go? He goes into the forest, right? He studies his ascetic practices, his meditation, his enlightenment's under a tree next to a stream. He teaches, he lives, and then he dies under trees. It's quite remarkable. He has this very special relationship with the natural world. And it's also striking, not just for him, but if you think about a lot of other sort of great spiritual figures, Jesus. What does he do after he's baptized by John the Baptist? He goes off into the desert for, 40 days and 40 nights, and Muhammad's cave and Milarepa's cave. There really does seem to be something very special about going off by oneself into the natural world. And the way that I tend to understand it, the way that I talk about it a little bit in the book, is how when we're in an urban setting together, we tend to reinforce a certain way of experiencing and relating to the world. I mean, it's very much connected with language, right? We grow up, part of growing up is learning how to talk, learning how to identify things. And it's not just identifying them, but seeing them as functions, learning how to use them for our own ends. And the result is that when we're together in an urban or even just a group situation, we're experiencing the world in a certain kind of collective, constructed way. And therefore, it can be really valuable to go off by oneself and to kind of let go of that, right? Like if you're by yourself out under a tree or next to a stream, it's totally different, right? You're not going to talk to the tree the way that you and I are talking to each other, right? You're embedded in a natural community, a community of living beings that are interrelated. And it's very different than looking around my office now and I see all these books and CDs and lights and pens and papers. Everything refers back to me, you know. So basically what I'm trying to say is the meditation in the natural world can be really valuable for sort of helping us deconstruct our usual way of experiencing and opening up to something bigger, sort of allowing it to deconstruct. So for me, that's the first part of Ecodharma that I tend to talk about.
And has been, as you point out so correctly, so many times in the Buddha's life as reference to his being in the natural world. And I don't think that was brought up by happenstance. I think that was very intentional, in the same way that, imagine how odd it would be if the suttas started with Gautama found himself in a cubicle facing north with the following stylus nearby and people in a cube farm. Of course, that will be quite exceptional and outrageous. So the mentions of this may tend to be in the background of our perception as we really engage with Buddhist scripture, and yet it is there. And to me, that itself is every bit as important as the particular dialogue that occurs in the engagement. That's the strong or highlight of the talk, is that background is very important and contributing to the overall experience.
It's a very interesting contrast, isn't it, with the way most of us meditate most of the time now, right? And four-cornered rooms, with windows and screens and temperature control and wind control and keeping out the insects. I mean, obviously, in many ways, that's very convenient, but we can't help wondering, is something lost there compared to that earliest forest tradition?
Yeah, it's very quiet and in some ways very separating and disconnecting. So I find that very different from when, as I'm sure you do, and you've mentioned that, when I sit outside and there are birds and insects and wind through pines, and that is an ample opportunity for engagement and reflection on what it is like. How is this body responding? And inseparable from that immediate environment of the moment.
As opposed to our sitting in zendos or whatever, that tends to reinforce our collective sense of separation from the natural world, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So what's the second big point?
Well, that refers more to the specific teachings. And again, there's a lot of things one can look at, point to, but one in particular jumps out for me, and that's one that I do explore in the book in some detail, and I have talked about it elsewhere. I see a fascinating parallel between what I think Buddhism is teaching us about our individual situation or predicament and our collective situation. Right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the way that I tend to understand it or express it is that our fundamental problem is duality, sense of separation, the delusion that there's a me kind of inside, separate from you and the rest of the world outside. And the Buddhist emphasis on dukkha, suffering, I think points to the fact that there's a frustration, a dissatisfaction built into this sense of separation. The way I tend to express it is that this sense of self being really a kind of a psychological, linguistic, social construct, because it's a construct, it's inherently insecure. It's inherently uncomfortable. It doesn't feel real enough, and it can't feel real enough because it's a construct in a way, this sense of separation. And we tend to misunderstand this, and life for many of us tends to be preoccupied with finding that which can make us feel more real, more grounded. And we look outside. If only I had enough money, if only I were famous only enough, if I was rich enough, whatever, things like that. If my body were beautiful enough, if my partner were perfect enough, right? We tend to get caught up in that, sort of motivated by something that we don't really fully understand. And I think there's something comparable on a collective scale now. It's not just that we have this individual sense of separation. Now, as we alluded to a minute ago, we also have this collective sense of separation as a species. As a now global civilization, we feel separate from the rest of the natural world. And again, this delusion of separation, first of all, it's a kind of construct. You don't have to think very hard to realize that we're not in the natural world. We're part of it, right?
Right.
If you think about it, I mean, if you don't think so, stop breathing for 4 minutes and see what happens, or stop drinking water, or see what that does to you. I mean, we're not on the earth. We're one of the ways the earth is manifesting. We're one of those many species. So the sense of separation is really crazy. And yet, well, the other thing to say is I think there's a real discomfort, again, a dukkha, dissatisfaction also built into this collective sense of separation. And I think one of the main ways it comes out is this: what's the meaning of life? Where are we going? What's it all about? I mean, I think in a way we have become totally caught up with technological development and especially economic growth because we don't know what else to do. It's like the means has become the ends. Right. I mean, economic growth can be very valuable if you know where you're going, but the means is, or as I say it in the book, why is more and more always better if it can never be enough?
Right. And as someone, as you know, my background is in biology, this concept of unrestrained or unchecked or continuing growth is not sustainable. For one thing, you run out of fuel. That's just the way it goes. Try running forever. You get a few blocks or you get a few miles or whatever. It just, you run out of steam. And the only environments or conditions under which there is unchecked growth is quite harmful. Cancer being an example of that. That is what unrestrained growth happens. And so seeing that rather than something which is taking into account the totality of the ecosystem, whatever it is. It doesn't even have to be necessarily a natural world. It can be financial world or the social world. We see right now this, I think, again, delusion of separation, particularly right now with identity politics of us versus them. And I would suggest perhaps not enough emphasis on we together as parts of this active and dynamic system that we are inseparable from. It's not possible to separate. There is no separation. We are a manifestation of this system.
I think Naomi Klein puts it very well when she makes the point that, we have two systems, right? There's our economic system, and it just the way capitalism works, it has to keep growing or it tends to collapse, right? When you look at the way the debt works, or even the way the stock market works, the value of a stock is its potential for future growth and returns. So there's that, and the other system is the biosphere, right? All the ecosystems, and the one of them has to keep growing, the other one can't grow. Sooner or later, there's going to be some conflict between them, and I think that's happening now, especially when you add in, of course, population issues.
Right.
Astonishing to think that the world's population is over 3 times what it was when I was born. Okay, I'm old, but I'm not that old. That's pretty shocking too. So
it is. That's in fact to me one of the greatest concerns is that is there, and occasionally it's odd for me when I will hear some people describing, hunters, for example, and say, "Oh, but we need to cull the herd for deer." So I don't imagine deer running rampant through the streets of downtown New York. So let's just set that aside. But if that were the case, how is that uniquely an experience of hunters and deer? How does having unchecked population growth, but that's not a problem when it's people? We are animals, and we're inhabiting the same spherical place that isn't going to get any bigger.
Our evolutionary psychology kicks into place there, right? It's like we're programmed to make babies. It's like our most fun thing ever. And of course, interestingly, all the major religions, with one exception, tend to promote that, right? Go forth and multiply. The one exception being Buddhism, interestingly, which doesn't say that anywhere,
right?
Really. It doesn't push that. But that, of course, complicates the ecological pressures enormously, especially when you try to look at it from the side of eco-justice. You know, how do we really share what's available justly, fairly with so many of the world's people? Yeah.
I'm kind of curious, David, as we're speaking, wondering about how social issues may or may not show up in the book, because again, I find that to be a very critical aspect to the overall system of living that we have on our planet. So I'm curious how that may have shown up in the book.
Yes, indeed. Well, I don't go into great detail, but early on, I acknowledge that. I think, you know, we can't just start talking about our ecological situation without acknowledging the interdependence with all of these other social issues, you know, issues of diversity, racism, gender. I mean, it's no accident that the people, the civilizations, societies most responsible for putting carbon into the atmosphere and starting this process, you think of Europe and so forth, it's like, so there are certain countries, there are certain races and so forth that are most responsible for that. And ironically, when it comes to the consequences, well, the consequences are
for others.
Yeah, well, sooner or later, and actually it's already happening for all of us, but there's no question that it's the poorest people.
Right.
I mean, if you look at Africa, for example, I mean, I think they've been responsible for something like 3% of the carbon in the last couple of centuries, and yet they're already experiencing a lot of devastation, and also South Asia. So there's an incredible disproportion there, and clearly as part of our response, we need to acknowledge it and find ways to help the people who are suffering the most and are going to suffer the most. I mean, Bangladesh, is that going to survive as a nation when we get great rises in sea level? It already has enormous problems there. Nonetheless, although I discuss that a little bit, it's not the main focus of the book, because there's so many other people, I think, doing a better job of that. So the focus is more, what might you call it, speciesism?
Yeah. And I think that itself is a very good point, David, is that we people can't cover everything always at all times. And I think that's one of the things I'm seeing more and more these days is a call for, but it wasn't this too. You didn't include my personal interest. And it's not to devalue those at all. They are critically important. And we can't focus on everything that's just simply not focused at all. And then nothing gets done. So I think that's a very good point that you make. And I wanted to ask, so is there anything else within that you want to talk about with part 2, or you want to move on to part 3?
Well, if the parallel that I'm talking about holds, we can't help wondering, right? It's like we have this collective as well as individual sense of separation, that there's not only delusion, but a lot of sort of suffering built into that. We misunderstand the basic problem, and we tend to make things worse in the way that we're relating to the natural world, exploiting it, right? So, I mean, the fundamental problem is that our non-duality means if the earth gets sick, we're going to get sick, right? So, because we're not separate. But the other interesting question, which I don't know that I have an answer to, but it's fascinating to reflect on, is there anything comparable then to what Buddhism talks about as awakening or enlightenment? Mm-hmm. What would it mean for us collectively to realize our non-duality with the earth? One thing I do talk a little bit about there is Paul Hawkins' book, Blessed Unrest, because he makes the point that something is happening now that's never happened before in human history. You have a very large number of people and organizations that are springing forth, as it were, spontaneously from the earth to work for social justice and sustainability and the kind of healing that's necessary. I think in his book, he originally estimated between 1 and 1.5 million. I think now he would say well over 2 million. And in the book, he uses the metaphor. He has a whole chapter on the idea of immune response.
I was just thinking, this sounds to me like an immune response.
Yeah, well, you're the biologist, so you would know. But he really talks, is that, and also thinking about young people now, right? Coming up, millennials, Generation Z, they can see what's coming down. They can see what's the future is. Can we understand this as the immune system of the earth responding to what we're doing to it? Mm-hmm. And anyway, one can play with those parallels, but I think we're at a kind of a turning point in civilization, to be quite honest, to kind of sum it up. I think civilization as we know it can't continue. I begin the book with a quotation from Swami Byandananda, this Brooklyn guru. I think he puts it very well when he says, there's bad news and there's good news. The bad news is that civilization as we know it is coming to an end. I think he's right. And the good news is civilization as we know it is coming to an end. Now, how much that's bad news, how much that's good news, how much it's going to happen to us, how much we're going to be able to steer that in the way we respond to it. But I think it's really on to something important there. Yeah.
You mentioned young people, and one of the things that I wanted to mention, I'll see if I can find the link for this for those who are listening and include it on the episode page for this episode. But there was a recent speech given by a young girl, a child, really, and it was to a large audience of adults, and I think she was Scandinavian, Swedish origin, something. Yeah. Well, maybe David, you can say a little bit about this. To me, this was really quite inspiring and a little bit reassuring that people like her exist. So I wonder if you're willing to share a little bit about it.
Well, Greta has come forth. In fact, she gave a talk at Davos, this big collection of billionaires in Switzerland, right? She gave a talk to them, and she's quite young. I think she's a Swedish schoolgirl, not much older than 13 or 14. And she seems to be one of the people spearheading what's becoming like a kind of school strike in parts of Northern Europe, where a lot of students are just refusing to go to school on Friday. And they're just sort of saying, look, we're not going to play this game. We're concerned about our future. And this strikes me as one aspect of something larger going on. I don't know if you've been following what's going on in England. There's this new group, Extinction Rebellion, and there's also groups here. What is it? The Sunrise Coalition. What I'm sensing is just in the last few months, certainly less than the last year, there's a kind of a change of consciousness. People are waking up to the fact that the kind of political and economic system we have, it can't be massaged sufficiently to really address these problems. We can't depend on politicians. Sometimes they'll do the right thing if you hold their feet to the fire, but how do you do that? And so a lot of more people are talking about direct action, nonviolent civil disobedience. Right. And I think, frankly, I've been suspecting for a while we're going to have to go there. And I think it's really coming to a head now, where within the next year or two, I think we could see a lot of that.
Yeah, it was interesting hearing, and to me, the most inspirational part of Greta's talk was, we're not here to ask you permission. We're telling you. And that is, of course, the taking of the direction that needs to occur. And Ocasio-Cortez's new Green Deal is being worked on, and seeing that perhaps those who are, in my mind, happily younger, and less prone to some of the mistakes that my generation has made in wanting to have change occur, and are working towards that. And what is the best way that we can support that and ensure that that actually happens going forward? Because us of an older generation or two or three haven't done such a good job of making that happen. And maybe they will. And I want to make sure that they get the chance to do that.
We need a revolution, a nonviolent revolution. And, older people, in some ways, being retired kind of frees us up. But in general, we're too comfortable. We're too set in our ways. And, it's younger people are going to make that revolution. And I think at the core of it is no business as usual. Business as usual is destroying the earth. It's making a lot of money for billionaires, yes. And again, a lot of the problem, I think, is, the people who control the political process and the people who control and own the economic process, they're the same people. So they want to keep going on pretty much the same way. Yeah, sure, we got problems. We got to tinker with this and that. But fundamentally, the problem is much deeper than that. And I think that's what a lot of young people are realizing.
Yeah, and seeing that even you had mentioned Davos, of course, with these talks, that there have been some pushback, some very strong pushback from people at Davos that you're actually part of the problem, that you're these incredibly wealthy individuals who are here to dole out little bits of things rather than changing the system that you depend on. And where this, to kind of bring this back to the Buddhisasana, is the motivation for them to continue to sustain the status quo, however much there may be some social consciousness involved with that, is based on this craving, this hunger, this tanha, this thirst.
So,
and how to address that.
Yeah. So, something I've talked about in the past and mentioned in the book, although I don't go into it so much there, is a kind of social application of the three poisons, right? So 3 poisons traditionally, greed, I like the word ill will for the second, and delusion for the third. And I think we've institutionalized them.
Yes.
Our economic system is institutionalized greed. If greed is you never have enough, right? Corporations are never profitable enough. It's not just that consumers want to consume more. It's the nature of the system. GDP is never big enough. Stock prices, dividends are never large enough. But as I said before, why is more and more always better if it can never be enough?
Right. Exactly.
I think we've institutionalized ill will. You look at our attitude toward people in prisons, our immigrants, and especially our militarism. Incredible militarism when you think about how large a military we have, how much we spend on it. And it's like we're always worried about other countries, but I think the amount that we spend on our military is something between it's roughly equivalent to between what the next 8 and 10 largest countries spend on their military. It's just so disproportionate. And the other side of that, of course, is if you spend that much on your military, you have to keep finding ways to use it. You've got to keep finding enemies. You've got to keep creating problems. You've got to find or make wars. Yeah.
Right. There's a motivation for those who are arms dealers. And even if we set aside judgment about that as a right livelihood and it not being so, even if we set that aside, there's still a motivation for, well, we got to use this ammo on someone.
So
yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And then the third, collective delusion. Well, we have a lot of talk recently about fake news, but more generally, even before that, most of the media are profit-making corporations, and they make their money not by informing or educating us, but finding ways to grab our eyeballs and sell them to the highest bidder, right? Including Facebook, right?
Yep.
So what that means is we're constantly being conditioned to think of ourselves as consumers and to be dissatisfied and to understand that the solution to our dissatisfaction is the next thing we're going to buy. So, I think those 3 poisons offer a kind of Buddhist social theory, if you really spend time working it out, as far as giving a Buddhist perspective on what the real source of our problem is. Yeah.
So, more about the book.
What about part 3? Sorry.
It's all right.
The third aspect of Ecodharma for me is the application, eco-activism, right? What does Buddhism have to offer? Then what does Buddhism say about what we should do? And it gets a little tricky because, again, this wasn't a problem in Buddhist cultures. So as I read it, Buddhism doesn't give us those specific examples of how we should respond, but I think it has a great deal to offer about how we do rather than what we do. And we can look at the precepts, we can look at a number of things. What stands out for me, perhaps most of all, and what the book concludes with, is this new understanding of the Bodhisattva path. Right? I mean, traditionally, that was mostly understood on the individual level. You help other people wake up, and it's pretty clear now we have to expand that to incorporate the social and ecological. That the Bodhisattva path means we're not just meditating for our own awakening or on our own equanimity or realizing our own emptiness, whatever, but we're also taking that and applying it, going out in the world in different ways. And we were mentioning it before about civil disobedience. I think that's quite consistent with Buddhist teachings, although, the emphasis there being on the nonviolence. But there's one particular thing that I think really stands out, because bodhisattvas are rooted or grounded in their own contemplative practice, because they continue to work on their own individual personal transformation. When they bring that into their social and eco-engagement, what that means is they're able to do something very precious, very special. They're able to act without attachment to results, which is kind of interesting. It's easy to misunderstand. It's like, oh, you only worry about your intentions, as long as your heart is pure, it doesn't. No, it's more than that.
Much more.
Yeah, what I think it really comes down to is the idea that our job, our task, is to do the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do makes any difference whatsoever. But that's our job, that's our task, that's our gift to the earth, that's our gift to each other. That's what it means to be non-attached to results. That it's what we're meant to be doing, like the immune system analogy. And we need to, I think in some ways, maybe this is the most important thing that Buddhism can contribute, the idea of realizing the non-duality between our own individual transformations, such as Buddhism traditionally talks about, works for, and the kind of social ecological transformation. We really need to work on both at the same time. And so the book talks quite a bit about that.
Well, for those who are interested in finding out more, of course, I'll have a link to Ecodharma Center and the book that we've been talking about as well. And our guest today, David Loy. David, really good to speak with you again, as always. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ted, for this invitation. I'm delighted to be back again.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.